Welcome everyone to our 11 o'clock session here at the Sport and Human Rights Conference. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Sarah Hamilton Rigg, who is a professor of equine studies at the University of New Hampshire. The study of human rights is interesting because there have been groups historically that were not considered to have rights, certainly certain races, genders, and animals. And we see the issue of today's presentation to talk about two different kinds of athletes, the human and the equine. We see human rights issues brought up with the Iditarod and the use of sled dogs, dog racing, and today we're going to talk about the exploitation, discrimination, and human rights issues that apply to equine studies. Studying about horses is often thought to be something that's recreational or cute, but it has broad ranges of academic study, political, physical, psychological, financial, and philosophical. Anyone who knows horses knows that they teach us a lot more than probably we teach them. And so Sarah is going to talk to us today. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you everyone for joining me on a discussion of human rights in the equestrian subculture. There we are. Have to get all the technology organized first. So thank you all for joining me for a discussion on human rights in the equestrian subculture. Equestrian sports are unique among international sports because they are interspecies sports, and men and women compete against each other equally. Equestrian sports are also unique because they're derived from the horse's traditional roles. Unlike other livestock species, the horse has never been used for food or fiber. And while it's often associated with agriculture, that has not been its greatest historic contribution. Until the 13th century, the ox was actually the farm animal of choice. And although the horse's efficiency in agricultural labor eventually had a sizable impact, the working horse population didn't peak until the Industrial Revolution, when urban workhorses far outnumbered those on farms. The horse's most significant historic roles have been for warfare, transportation, and work, all of which are means of obtaining and maintaining wealth and power. And as a result, the horse has always been associated with privilege and inherently linked to socioeconomic class, gender, and race. Horse sports and horse breeds evolved from the horse's traditional uses, and participation in equestrian sports was restricted to those with access to the horse through the privilege of either wealth or work. In the 20th century, while society at large turned away from horsepower and became increasingly focused on mechanization and technology, equestrians used sport to preserve the heritage of horsemanship. And although the American horse population sharply decreased with the adoption of the automobile, it has more than doubled since 1960 and is still nearly double its 1940 level. More than 76% of American horses today are used for racing, competition, or recreation. Only 8% have non-sport working roles, and draft horses now represent less than 5% of the U.S. equine population. Although the workhorse has faded from public life, the horse's long history and value in society preserved its status and the public sentiment surrounding it. Most Americans don't see horses in their lives, but more than 30% of American households own horses, participate in equestrian activities, or spectate at equestrian events each year, and 83% of Americans oppose equine slaughter. However, active participation in equestrianism remains an outlier in society. Only 17.3% of American households have a household member who regularly participates, and only 1.3% own horses. The United States has actually a very rich equestrian tradition and has more distinct horse sports and more recognized horse breeds than any other country. This vast array of specialties can be sorted into three broad categories: quantitative sports, where results are determined by time, points, or penalties; qualitative sports, where results are determined by judging the form, style, or movement of the horse or rider against an ideal; and breed competitions, which are restricted to a registered breed and include classes for breeding stock and performance. Despite these differences, equestrians share common experiences, all shaped by the horse, and they develop unique attributes compared to the rest of society. This common experience forms the basis of the subculture of equestrianism, within which all equestrian sports exist. Outsiders to the equestrian subculture perceive it as a monolith, but insiders recognize a wide variety of specialties and tend to identify most strongly with their particular subniche or affinity group. Today, equestrian sports are therefore both known and unknown. They're easily recognized yet poorly understood, which has created an insider-outsider dynamic relative to membership in the equestrian subculture. And that has the typical consequences of outsiders stereotyping and even othering subcultural members, which prompts further insularity and defensiveness by insiders. This is fertile ground for the creation of misconceptions. Outsiders may misinterpret or miss nuance and meaning. Comparatively, insiders may dismiss criticisms or be unable to objectively evaluate practices and ideas. Notably, misconceptions are not exclusively held by outsiders, and together misconceptions obscure the issue of human rights in equestrian sport. Misconception number 1, horseback riding is not a sport. The act of riding is first staying balanced on a moving object, which requires the rider to keep their center of mass over that of the horse. Unlike other vehicles, the horse's motion is not linear. The horse's back rises and falls, extends and contracts, and stretches and compresses in 3 dimensions with the movement of the limbs. To maintain equilibrium during that motion, the rider has to make continual micro corrections, primarily with their core and their legs, not just with each stride, but with every footfall within every stride, which is a rate of at least 160 and up to 540 footfalls per minute, depending upon the gait, all of which is done while traveling at speeds of up to 55 miles an hour with no seatbelt. Equestrian sports also further include much larger motions in any of these 3 dimensions, requiring the rider to make larger adjustments to stay balanced during both expected and unexpected dramatic movements. The efforts involved in achieving these physical corrections results in elevated respiration and heart rate in the rider, as well as muscle development by the rider. Over time, participation in horseback riding correlates with measurable improvements in indicators of health and athletic development, all of which are changes consistently identified with physical benefits of participation in other sports. Ergo, we can conclude that horseback riding is a sport. Misconception number 2. Horseback riding is easy because the horse does all the work. Unlike vehicles which simply obey the will of the driver, horses are living creatures with their own perceptions, instincts, reactions, and desires. They're capable of spontaneous and unexpected action, and they're capable of disagreeing with the rider's intention. While the rider is learning to stay balanced, they also have to learn to understand and communicate with the animal to engender cooperation, which is not guaranteed. The average sport horse weighs 1,000 pounds. It can sprint up to 55 miles an hour and is far stronger than a human with faster reaction time and sharper senses. So it simply isn't possible to force the horse to comply. Success requires the rider to learn to communicate with the horse and also learn to understand and anticipate the horse's behavior. The horse's brain is smaller than the human brain and has much smaller frontal lobe. So the horse's behavior is driven by instinct, not logic. And those instincts and behaviors are the products of the horse's evolution. The horse is an ungulate and it evolved in North America. It shares an ecological niche at the bottom of the food chain with other large herbivores. But it doesn't share their horns or antlers. So the horse's survival was solely dependent upon efficient and ready flight. Behaviorally, it was therefore very different than these other animals, and this also distinguishes the horse from our other large domestic species. In fact, although the auric was much more physically imposing, the horse, due to its volatile nature, was domesticated approximately 5,000 years after the cow. And although domestication has tempered the flight response, it hasn't changed the horse's instincts. And unlike other domesticates, horses have never been bred for meat, milk, or fiber production, but for enhanced physical potential for speed, power, and agility. And while domestic cattle are smaller than their wild ancestor, The modern sport horse is far larger than its progenitor. Equestrian sports are derived from the horse's flight instinct. So breeding sport horses has actually further enhanced the horse's physical potential, which the rider must now learn to successfully balance on and direct. So the horse may provide the physical force in equestrian sport, but success is neither guaranteed nor easy given the combination of the horse's movement and nature. Misconception number 3. All equestrians are jockeys. Although horse racing is highly visible and accounts for about a third of the American equine industry, most equestrians are not jockeys, and they're not directly involved in the horse racing industry. Racing sports have many key differences compared to non-racing sports. Wagering is a significant part of the business model. Race eligibility is restricted to purebred animals of certain breeds only. And most importantly for our discussion today, jockeys and drivers are licensed professionals. They have age requirements and requirements for training and experience, as well as weight requirements. Comparatively, in non-racing sports, most participants are amateurs, and they're of all ages, including senior citizens, but there's a very high proportion of youth participants. And there's no requirement for licensure for participants. In non-racing sports, participation conforms to Green's model of sports participation, with the majority at the entry or recreational level. Although there are elite competitors of all ages and professional riders at a variety of levels of competition, the vast majority may not compete, let alone ever advance to a national or international level of the sport. Comparatively, to even train for a jockey's license, a rider must have superb experience, skill, and athletic ability. Although some jockeys are more skilled than others, they're all professionals, with the exception of apprentices or trainees. But even though those riders aren't yet licensed, they still ride at top speed, so they're not beginners. Misconception number 4. Equestrians can ignore the perceptions of outsiders and controversies related to other sub-niches within equestrian sport. The horse is an example of charismatic megafauna, large animal species with symbolic value or widespread popular appeal. Human activity involving charismatic megafauna or impacting them depends on a social license to operate, or an SLO, which is the unspoken agreement of society to tolerate an activity. Society at large grants it, and it has the power to limit or withdraw it through regulation. Public perception matters because the SLO is granted or withdrawn by public perceptions. Equestrians may identify with their subniche or affinity group and dismiss issues in other affinity groups as not being applicable to their specific sport. But public perception of equestrian sport is monolithic and far less nuanced. Society at large makes no distinction between types of equestrian sport. In the eyes of society, every equestrian is judged by the collective perception of the equestrian subculture by the layperson. So equestrians must all take ownership of the entire subculture and perceptions of it. Misconception number 5. The only necessary conversations about athletes' rights in equestrian sport are conversations surrounding equine welfare. The welfare of the horse is paramount to the legitimacy of equestrian sport, which requires ethical use of the animals that make the sport possible. And the perceived welfare of the horse is critical to the continuance of its SLO and its ability to operate without restrictions or regulations imposed by outsiders. Well-being of the horse is also the foundation of horsemanship, which is the fundamental ethos of equestrianism. While outsiders define horsemanship as simply skill at riding horses, insiders have a much more nuanced and specific definition, which is perhaps best articulated by noted equestrian philosopher Charles de Kunfi, who wrote that horsemanship is a specific human attitude towards horses. This attitude is eminently characterized by concern for the well-being of the horse. Consequently, a horseman or an equestrian is not just anybody interested in or involved with horses. Horsemanship is based on a love for the horse. It is not practiced for the glorification of the rider. According to Erich Fromm, foremost among psychiatrist philosophers, love is the active promotion of the well-being of the love object, in this case, the horse. Unfortunately, though, outsiders who grant the SLO don't understand that more nuanced and complex definition of horsemanship. And despite the ethos of horsemanship, there are still accidents, bad actors, and incidents of abuse and neglect in equestrian sport. Bad stories, of course, travel far faster in cyberspace than good examples. And whereas equestrians often deflect responsibility with dismissals like, well, that's another specialty, it doesn't apply to me or what I do, outsiders judge all equestrians collectively by those negative stories. But horses are only one half of equestrian competitors. Although horsemanship places the well-being of the horse above all else, there are two athletes in equestrian sport. Placing a human athlete in the saddle does not mean that that athlete's rights are void or inviolable. Recent human rights issues in equestrian sport have included a lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion, athlete abuse, labor rights issues, and allegations of gender bias. The ethos of putting the horse first may actually reduce equestrians' awareness of or concern about human rights. Insiders also tend to dismiss these incidents as unrelated or isolated. But outsiders take notice of news regarding social issues in equestrianism and make judgments based on that. Addressing human rights in equestrian sport is critical to protect participants and to preserve the social license to operate. Yet despite these issues, equestrian sport at all levels of participation may actually help to advance human individual rights by facilitating the quest for self-actualization through its unique combination of attributes: the opportunity to enhance health and self-confidence through fitness and achievement, regular low-frequency movement to facilitate finding the positive cognitive state of flow, the opportunity for bonding with the animal, the need to confront an ever-present possibility of failure and to build resilience after mistakes, and the constant challenge and need to practice sustained concentration. This combination makes equestrian sport uniquely conducive to developing grit, flow, self-belief, and self-identity, which are transferable qualities critical to self-actualization that may have even greater impact for adolescents and pre-adolescents who are in the process of identity formation, especially girls and young women who are subject to societal pressures enforcing heteronormative and objectified gender roles during this period. So equine welfare and human rights are both central to equestrian sport. Equestrian sport understandably emphasizes the protection of the animals that make the sport possible. But protecting the human rights is very important to protect human athletes and ensure inclusivity and equity so that we can ensure the well-being of participants and the future of the sport. The potential benefits suggest expanding participation in equestrian sports could actually enhance human development and self-actualization. But the sport's lack of diversity suggests human rights are also relevant factors inhibiting equestrian participation. Misconception number 6. The origins and history of equestrian sport are irrelevant in the subculture of equestrianism today. Equestrian sports are inextricably intertwined with the rich fabric of the subculture of equestrianism. Sport has preserved traditional knowledge, practices, and attitudes from horsemanship's previous roles in society. Heritage of the sport continues to influence participation demographics and the power structure of the sport. And equestrianism continues to be an activity that privileges participants by socioeconomic class, race, and gender. Many sports originate from the horse's military roles and military training, which were inherently gendered activities. The war horse was a powerful weapon that was not available to everyone and was often turned against communities of color, especially during the last millennium. Withholding the horse was a practice deployed to enforce and preserve power structure. And thus, while the horse was associated with power and victory, it was also associated with cultural destruction, colonialism, and slavery. A person on horseback was inferred to have power. Therefore, who was allowed to ride on horseback, whether for purpose or for leisure, had political, social, and symbolic meaning, which continues to affect attitudes and participation today. The horse is still seen as a status symbol, but the perceptions of society have changed. There's greater awareness of inequality and social injustice, both historic and contemporary. There's an increasing economic divide and greater economic hardship for the middle and working class Americans. And there's increased societal discourse regarding these issues. Increased visibility of the equestrian subculture also exists now due to social media. In a world that strives to be more just, Status is no longer viewed only aspirationally, but also critically. A society asks at what cost are power and wealth attained, and who pays for them? More than 90% of the United States Equestrian Federation identify as white and non-Hispanic. News stories regarding athlete abuse, racial inequality, and dependence on immigrant labor in equestrian sport have garnered significant attention. And chatter online increasingly characterizes equestrians in negative terms and stereotypes, in part due to these issues. This conversation is happening with or without equestrians in it, and it will decide the future of the SLO of the sport. So it's time for equestrians to acknowledge their heritage, even the problematic part, and address the perceptions and the problems of equestrianism. Misconception number 7. All participants in equestrian sport are wealthy. There is significant cost involved in keeping horses and owning them in particular, especially at higher levels of competition. However, the majority of participants do not own a horse and rarely or never compete. Low-cost entry points into the sport exist and are comparable to or less expensive than gym memberships, club fees, and equipment costs of other youth sports and adult hobbies. Working student situations or other barter arrangements are also common means of defraying costs. So there are individuals of extreme wealth who participate in equestrian sport, but the average participant is middle class. However, privilege is relative. Even the workhorse was a mark of privilege. Not all workers could afford to keep a horse, and not all people were allowed to work for their own financial enrichment. The average equestrian doesn't consider themselves wealthy, especially when compared to the very wealthy participants in the sport. But the opportunity to participate in a hobby or a youth sport is a privilege that many can't afford. Even being able to barter labor for riding time is a luxury when many are working extra jobs, shifts, or hours just to scrape by with basic necessities. However, the existence of low-cost entry points into the sport refutes the argument that the financial barrier is the reason for the lack of diversity in the equestrian community, which is in itself an inherently racist argument because it assumes that all families and individuals of color are low income. Privilege, access, and inclusivity are all factors in equestrian participation. Now, there are systemic factors in the United States. Wealth is not distributed equally, and due to the legacy of segregation, redlining, and other racist practices, people of color are more likely to live in urban areas where they may have less equine contact. However, communities of color are not monolithic. There are many, many individuals of color with financial means, potential access, or both. If cost were the only factor, diversity would be greater. Inclusivity is also an issue. Across disciplines, equestrians of color, including professionals and high-performance athletes, report both overt and subtle incidents of unconscious and deliberate bias and racism. And nearly all report regularly being asked, how did you get involved in horseback riding? Which implies that riders of color don't belong in equestrian sport. Misconception number 8, equestrianism is a European tradition. Horses were first domesticated in the Eurasian steppes. Asian, South Asian, and Middle Eastern horsemen were all skilled warriors and horse breeders who developed the saddle and the stirrup, breeds that are foundational to all modern sporting breeds, and the game of polo. Both English and Western equestrian sport trace their heritage to the alla gineta style of riding, which was brought to Europe by skilled Northern African horsemen. Horses from Northern Africa were foundational to many modern sports breeds, and Black horsemen had a great influence on the development of American equestrian culture, accounting for 25% of cowboys, more than half of the first 44 Kentucky Derby winners, and making significant contributions to the development of the American thoroughbred, the gaited breeds of the United States, and the United States racing industry. Hispanic horsemen pioneered Western riding and rodeo and comprised a significant proportion of cowboys. Male charros and female escaramuzas were renowned for their refined horsemanship skills and spectacular roping and were featured in Wild West shows. And indigenous groups who adopted the horse became exceptional horsemen and breeders, developing breeds including the Appaloosa and the Chickasaw horse, which contributed to the American quarter horse. Indigenous horsemen also worked on the range and were very successful in early rodeo. Misconception number 9. The lack of diversity in equestrian sport is a reflection of interest or accident. Although access to the horse was always jealously guarded by the powerful, equestrianism at large, and in the American West in particular, were far richer and more diverse than the present participation suggests. However, horsemen of color were always dependent upon society's permission to have access to horsepower. During the post-Reconstruction period, a combination of economic despair, disillusionment, rising immigration, and xenophobia led to Hispanophobia, increased racism, and Jim Crow laws. These forces drove many riders of color out of racing, horse showing, rodeo, and ranch work. Removal and destruction of indigenous herds was a tool used to facilitate forced assimilation, cultural destruction, reservation confinement, and genocide of indigenous people. Hispanic riders were deliberately underemployed and discriminated against, and the history of equestrianism in the West itself was whitewashed and anglicized in popular culture. The same forces created the myth of the Anglo cowboy, the knight errant of the White West that never was. The Anglo cowboy was a romantic escapist fantasy of urban workers, which put a handsome face of the preferred ethnicity on the taming of the West, overlooking the violence and destruction wrought by Western expansion. The creation of the mythical cowboy was also marked the beginning of the end for the professional rodeo cowgirls, who had populated rodeo in the 19th and early 20th centuries. At a time when few women worked outside the home, these riders earned independent livings and supported families by competing alongside and even against men, often besting them in events women are still barred from today, such as bronc riding and steer wrestling. Misconception number 10. There's gender equity in equestrian sport. Women have long been associated with horses. Due to the nature and physicality of the horse, men don't have a measurable physical advantage in the saddle, even when women are confined to riding side saddle. But women's ability to participate in equestrian sport has also been dependent on permission from larger society, and that social power has advantaged men. Society's tolerance of women's equestrianism has fluctuated. Often, horseback riding has been one of the only acceptable forms of exercise for women. But women on horseback had the freedom to escape domestic confines and expand their social contacts. So equestrians have often been associated with independence and power, which hasn't always been considered desirable. The equestrian has been considered a social outsider, and equestrians' defiance of social convention and gender norms regularly led to their stigmatization, particularly through sexual objectification, which recast them into roles subservient to male power and the male gaze. Until the 14th century, women rode astride, and thus had the freedom to control their own horse and to travel and participate in sport. Forcing women into pillion chairs confined them to the walk and prevented them from steering their own horse, which restricted women's movement and their social contacts and placed them under the control of male family members. The invention of the side saddle with the single horn in the 16th century allowed women to face forward and to steer, which improved travel, although speed was still impossible, and allowed for participation in light recreation and for escape from the confines of the domestic sphere and the supervision. The side saddle thus conferred greater mobility and independence, and later innovations improved the ability to ride at moderate speed and for extended periods. This allowed participation in a broader range of sport, especially game hunting and haute école training, and freedom to travel and enhance social connections at a time when social contact was currency. The female equestrianism became a mark of individual and family status and could further be improved through social alliances made in horseback fields activities. Accordingly, mistresses and courtesans were accepted and regular participants in equestrian sport, but this revolution in women's independence and social order provoked a backlash against the female equestrian. Women of the Enlightenment were actually blamed for social upheaval, including feminization of male elites, which was thought to have contributed to the French Revolution. Equestrians who practiced the military art of haute école were seen as potentially dangerous threats to the social order. Comparatively, huntresses were eventually stigmatized, and all were assumed to be of suspect virtue. The term huntress and vixen, implying pejorative sexuality of a strong-willed woman, came into use during this period. and the sexual objectification both minimized the power of the equestrian in society and discouraged respectable women from participating. This transformation is best exemplified by the transformation of the historical figure Lady Godifu into the nude allegory Lady Godiva, which shows the use of reductionist sexual objectification to diminish the equestrian's power, independence, and agency, and implied threat in society, reducing her power to an objectified sexuality within the male gaze. Functionally, the breeding of faster foxhounds and the partitioning of the countryside transformed hunting from a leisurely day-long ride into a jump-filled gallop that was impossible for the side-saddle rider, which took all women out of the field until the invention of the leaping horse in the 19th century, which allowed side-saddle riders to now gallop and jump. By then, Victorian convention confined women to the domestic sphere and was less accepting of athletic women. But many participated despite the potential stigma, as this was one of the only means to escape the confinements of the home. And many others further defied social norms by participating in races and working as professional equestrians, including écuyers of the Paris Circus and the Belle Époque. Sexual objectification persisted as a means to diminish all equestrians' power and independence, which challenged the assumptions of female frailty and inferiority. Despite the convention of female frailty, Victorian equestrians were advised to become comfortable jumping 5-foot fences. So the equestrian's existence inherently challenged and disproved gender norms. Side saddle riders were actually less likely to fall than cross saddle riders. However, their riding habit made them much more vulnerable. They were much more likely to be crushed if the horse fell, which the habit could cause. And riders who did fall were more likely to be dragged. Further, a rider without a leg on the offside has less leverage and is less able to correct a playful or fractious horse. Because of the risk that the side saddle created, riders needed a horse that was sure-footed and unlikely to be fresh, playful, or strong, which gave rise to the term lady's horse. But this erroneously led to a myth conflating inferior riding strength and skill with the desire to simply mitigate the risk caused by the saddle. And that myth that female riders aren't as strong or aren't as tough continues to hamper perceptions of and opportunities for female riders today. As horse power faded from society and horse sport became ascendant, there was gender revolution in equestrianism in the United States. More than 85% of equestrians are female. At the lower levels of equestrian sport, 90%, or actually probably closer to 95% of riders are female. Yet men disproportionately advance to and through the elite levels across all disciplines and make up of more than half of elite level riders, coaches, and trainers. Actual participation in equestrian sport reveals that the apparent equity of men and women competing head-to-head hides a two-tiered system in which women dominate the lower level, but have difficulty attaining advancement to the upper level. The vast majority of equestrians are female, and riding is now heavily feminized in popular culture and heavily marketed towards pre-adolescent girls. But at the same time, the equestrian is still socially stigmatized. And power remains concentrated in a structure dominated by male superstars, trainers, owners, sponsors, and coaches who have the access and esteem to grant opportunities and approval for up-and-coming riders. The gender power imbalance is not just an issue of equity of advancement. This large population of frequently underage women is vulnerable. There have been multiple high-profile cases of athlete abuse, which reveals a disturbing pattern. The majority of victims have been girls and underage women, the very population to whom society aggressively promotes equestrianism. So the myth of gender equity and the disproportionate number of female participants may actually obscure a dangerous inequality. And that then makes the sexual objectification of the equestrian much more relevant and considerably more sinister, and underscores the connection between equestrianism's heritage and its present human rights concerns. The modern era of gender inequality is a product of the heritage of equestrian subculture and the attitudes it has preserved, as is the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in modern equestrian sport. In the context of the entire equestrian subculture, past and present, These issues are clearly neither isolated nor unrelated, but a systematic problem that must be acknowledged and addressed on a structural level. And the rights of both equine and human participants must be protected for the well-being of all and for equestrianism's continued legitimacy and social license. So I'd like to thank you all for joining me for this gallop through human rights in the equestrian subculture. And I certainly will be very happy to take questions.
Professor Hamilton, you are brilliant. Linking gender and racial inequality to the equine world and human rights is really quite an innovative, provocative, brilliant connection. For everyone watching, please note that she drew all of the graphics. So we can look forward to your book. Now, we do have a question that's been posed. I will said, it's interesting to think about the inequities that play out in how youth access equine activities. It's similar to how many youth of color do not have access to skiing or outdoor activities like hiking. Involvement with horses could yield multiple benefits, including physical activity, increased mental health, and enjoying time outside. Are there any programs you want to share that are models of how we can create more meaningful opportunities for youth to access these sports?
There are outstanding programs that are out there. And it's such an amazing range. And in my opinion, one of the most inspiring opportunities in the equine industry. There are oftentimes programs are fairly little known and little recognized. So there are wonderful, actually one of the cool things, to just share some interesting trivia, there are many urban riding leagues. We think of horses as being suburban or rural activities. There are actual urban horsemen in a variety of large cities. Some of the most notable are in Philadelphia and in Compton, but they also exist in cities all over the country. And what's really inspiring, and this is one of the reasons why I feel it's so important for everyone to understand the rich subculture of equestrianism. It continues to influence our activities today, but it's also inspiring for horse people to realize that the equestrian subculture is such a richer and more diverse place than we might necessarily realize. Many of the urban herds that continue to exist are actually the product of the legacy of Black horsemen, who, as the range closed, these Black cowboys moved to locations in cities where workhorses were still being used and preserved urban horsemanship. And so there are wonderful organizations. Another outstanding one is in Connecticut, the Ebony Horsewoman. And she is a wonderful, wonderful equestrian role model who's also been very involved in promotion of diversity in our national governing body of equestrian sport, the United States Equestrian Federation. And these groups provide an opportunity for young people who don't necessarily have easy access to the horse in their location to not have to travel to then go get horse access, but to have access closer to them. And those are fabulous opportunities. There are also now more and more urban polo leagues that are producing amazing polo athletes, many of whom have gone on to become professionals, and many of whom have also participated in collegiate polo. Some of the historically Black university and colleges also have now outstanding polo teams. One of the challenges is that some of these grassroots organizations that do such tremendous work getting a more diverse group of young people into the sport don't have the same financial resources that some of the elite performance organizations have. So a problem that, for example, has been identified in polo is that there's much more diversity at the entry level of the sport now. But those clubs that do such wonderful, wonderful work to enhance the reach of the sport and bring young people into the sport for their own enjoyment and benefit and development, don't necessarily have the same financial backings of the wealthy patrons that are seen in the upper echelon of high goal polo. It would be great cosmically in equestrian sport to have more cross-pollination between the elite levels of the sport and the entry level of the sport for all participants. Oftentimes, high performance organizations concentrate on elite athlete and athlete development. And there are wonderful grassroots programs at a variety of locations, and also include things like 4-H and FFA. They don't have as much communication with those upper echelons of the sport. And having better facilitation between riders themselves and education and participation and communication going up and down would be a wonderful goal for the sport to help cosmically address and globally address the challenges that it's going to face, not just from an equine welfare standpoint, but from a human rights standpoint.
Thank you. You have two more questions. One is, what do you feel may account for the loss of women at the upper levels? Or is there no loss and it's an issue of men being elevated more in the public eye at that level?
The loss of women at the upper levels, it's always, actually, breakthroughs have always been challenging. There are many accounts of women struggling to advance into the teams, although women in competitive equestrian sport were tolerated as amateurs in the early post-war period when, and actually that's what I should back up and say, equestrian sport was oftentimes associated with military activities. And in fact, prior to the 1954 Olympics, in order to be an equestrian competitor in the Olympics, you actually had to be a military officer, which ergo restricted women's participation or banned it entirely, as it did also amateurs. Initial forays into equestrian sport, although they were tolerated, women were tolerated amateurs, and women were actually oftentimes criticized in print and by news stories, by judges, by team selectors, as women were interfering with men's need to make a living. Similarly, it wasn't until the 1960s when women were allowed to play polo professionally or granted a jockey's license. And the person who first received their jockey's license did so with an affirmative action lawsuit. This was a rider who'd already represented the United States in the Olympics and was more than qualified, and the Maryland Racing Board refused to license her. So women were always being behind the gates once we started talking about modern equestrian sport. Although the groundswell came in as the amateurs, the initial trainers and coaches and instructors were all ex-cavalry officers, or predominantly ex-cavalry officers, and thus again, a male-dominated cohort. Those were also the judges and the individuals who were picking teams and high-performance riders and who served on boards of equestrian sport, and thus there was always a backlog. In the last 40 years, we see more equality at the Olympic levels, but in horse racing, 90% of jockeys in this country are still male. Polo riders, women dominate the lower levels, but the myth still persists that women who ride and play polo, even at the high goal level, aren't as strong or tough. And so patrons who select high performance teams don't select women at the same amount. And there even have been allegations of boy points in recent periods and in the last year, that in those qualitative sports, judges may gravitate towards male riders in the field and may award them more highly or judge them more highly. So these are areas, and then having this conversation proves to be difficult. It is an insular sport, has a tendency to be sometimes not as open to outside ideas. And so in news stories covering the existence of boy points, professionals in the sport, make statements that go along the lines with, well, you can just coach boys harder. Or if women just ride as hard as boys do, then they'll get the same credit, which is inherently a gender biased argument. And then, of course, another challenge is that there are no organizations that I've found that publicly either address or share figures about non-binary athletes. So we're leaving out a whole segment of equestrianism from this conversation as well. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in gender equality. It may be masked because there are so many women. And actually, that is another attitude that, oh, well, there are so many women at the entry level. It's great that men manage to advance so well. And I would posit that actually we need to look at this, that this doesn't pass a statistical examination. If women are 95% of some sports, yet men are more than half of elite athletes, there is something by which women are not receiving the same opportunities and the same selection.
Oh, thank you so much for that wonderful observation. The last point in the box was outstanding view. The linkage was quite a connection. Wow on the presentation, graphics, explanation, and that there are many equine programs that have been upcoming programs that work with at-risk youth and persons with disability. Often it's a cost factor. It's a brilliant job. Please share that I was very impressed with the linkage.
Oh, well, thank you very, very much. And cost is certainly a factor. Horses are far more expensive than some other sports. That said, there is also tremendous financial wealth in the sport. And right now, that is oftentimes concentrated in elite performance and advancement of athletes into elite performance. One of my personal views is, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had more connection between the elite levels of high performance athletes and the grassroots entry levels of the sport? So that, and if there would be a lot of wonderful wealth of information and positivity shared, but if we could distribute some of the financial backing power at the elite level into entry levels to help defray costs and create positive pathways, it would be a wonderful development in the sport. And it actually also might help to refute some of the negative stereotypes that persist regarding equestrianism. There are certainly elite riders of elite socioeconomic status, and sometimes that leads to some of the negative stereotyping and assumptions made that riders are not truly engaged with the well-being of their horses. Truthfully, the grassroots levels, where it's kids of all backgrounds or youth of all backgrounds or adults of all backgrounds engaged with horses and benefiting, that would be a wonderful thing to be able to get more optics and more coverage of, to help contradict that and show the fabric of equestrianism as more rich and more diverse and more positive, to help to promote the sport better and change some of the negative opinions in society. So I think we have the means, but right now, just as it is in polo, it's directed more to the upper ends of the sport. If we could find a way to distribute that, it would actually benefit everyone in the sport by helping to preserve the SLO and improve diversity, equity, and inclusion and recognition of the very rich heritage that we all take part in when we sit in a saddle.
With that perfect ending, well, thank you so very, very much. And we're going to take a 10-minute break or so and get ready for the next presentation, which will be with Kim Krantz at noon. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.